In the early years of emulation, Nintendo bullied Ultra HLE into shutting down under the threat of a lawsuit. The rules weren't clear back then, and the devs weren't equipped for a legal fight, so they folded. Then 2 emulator suits did go all the way to court, and backfired in the most embarrassing possible way for the console industry. Sony's back-to-back losses against Connectix and Bleem established the precedent that emulators are fully legal, which has shielded developers ever since. Which is why it was a surprise when Nintendo suddenly launched a suit against Yuzu this year. It suggested to me, an expert who has read almost 4 articles on the subject, that either Nintendo had gotten drunk enough off that Switch money to brazenly pick this fight again, or that the Yuzu devs had been sloppy enough to hand Nintendo a case. The recent shutdown of Ryujinx suggests it was probably the former more than the latter. Before diving into this, I admit I have no insight to offer on the law, so I'll be checking in with an actual attorney, who's been kind enough to Zoom with me on his vacation to provide... Look, I'm not a law expert. We'll start with everyone's favorite, Nintendo's easily debunked bullshit. In their statement against Yuzu, they devoted a lot of time to how important retro games are to them, and how emulation undercuts their ability to sell those games. You might not be surprised to learn that Sony also brought up money in the Connectix case they lost, with the judges ruling, and I'm paraphrasing here, who gives a fuck? You can't have something made illegal just because it costs you sales. The emulators were protected by fair use, had a right to be sold, and were deemed legitimate competitors. The judges not only tolerated this competition, they argued it would be good for the industry. And bear in mind that the PlayStation was still on store shelves at that time. Being the current platform didn't protect it. Nintendo's complaints about lost sales seem completely answered by that ruling, and if anything, spending so much time bragging about how many Switch units and games they've sold undermines their entire point. They're obviously not hurting that badly while enjoying the record highest sales they've ever had in their history. Metroid Prime Remastered was a particularly bad example to cite here, because if anything it proves that emulation should not be a threat. Fans had done a lot of work to enhance that game specifically. An entire emulator fork was created for it, with modern controls and graphics fixes. Few games get that kind of attention. Aether Labs was also working on a comprehensive visual overhaul that would have been really cool when it was done. And with just a smattering of effort, Nintendo released a version that blew all of that out of the water, with better visuals and modernizations than fans could have provided. And that's how it's supposed to be. The company with billions of dollars and seasoned professionals should be able to outdo fans working in their spare time. If they fail to produce a compelling product, it's entirely their fault. If Nintendo did find itself unable to sell an old title, it would probably be because they phoned it in with the absolute minimum effort and polish possible. Except I can't find any examples of that happening, because even when they do squat out buggy duds, they still move millions. Mario 3D All-Stars was embarrassingly weak compared to fan efforts, yet still sold 9 million units. And remember that this game was only available for a short window of time before being pulled from sale. Metroid Prime Remastered itself was shadow dropped in February and managed to sell 1 million units by the end of the fiscal year in March. So Nintendo's argument here is, we're not able to sell anything because of emulation. As an example, look at this 20-year-old game from a commercially underperforming series that just sold 1 million copies in a month with no build-up or ad campaign. You dopes. You clowns. There were allegations from Nintendo and the community alike that the Yuzu developers had flagrantly crossed the line numerous times, some of which does seem damning. Their aborted Switch Online plans were really ill-conceived, and the devs certainly could have been more careful about what they said and did, publicly and privately. Some of the longest-standing accusations against the team seem like bullshit. The idea that they stole code from other emulators is overblown at the very least. But the shutdown of Ryujinx makes those allegations less relevant. Nintendo's ire clearly wasn't exclusive to the Yuzu team or their conduct. In reality, it was your conduct that caused this. It was Tears of the Kingdom leaking early and being mass-pirated, streamed, and spoiled that made Nintendo go berserker. Just days after the leak occurred, and almost a year before the Yuzu suit, Nintendo started targeting the tools needed to dump Switch games and prod keys. And of course they did. They lost control over one of the biggest game launches of the generation because of this fuck-up. They weren't going to shrug that off. I respect that Nintendo absolutely has the right to protect its games from this kind of damage, but Yuzu became a sort of fall guy for the actions of the community at large. They weren't the ones who broke Street Date for Tears of the Kingdom. They didn't develop or release the tools that dumped the game, nor did they leak it to the internet. Their releases wouldn't run it. It was only possible via an external hack that they had nothing to do with, and they banned any discussion of it from their server. They also didn't commit any game-specific fixes before the public launch. I'm not saying the developers were perfect angels that did everything by the book, but Yuzu is no more directly liable for piracy than any other emulator is here. The best that Nintendo can come up with here is that by linking to circumvention tools in their startup guide, they may be secondarily trafficking them, but the argument is more of a shot in the dark than a killing blow.
Is that trafficking in a portion of a service? I don't know. That's a close question. I suspect that Yuzu probably has the stronger argument there, but it's not an argument that I can just dismiss summarily at the opening levels.
They also dwelled a lot on Yuzu's progress reports and day one support for games in general. On the face of it, this shouldn't matter. The goal of emulation is to accurately reproduce the functions of a system. If a new Switch game runs on a program specifically designed to run Switch games, it's not earth-shattering news, especially not when the game is a sequel running on an engine that emulator devs have already grappled with. Both Yuzu and Ryujinx prepared day one support for Tears of the Kingdom by optimizing Breath of the Wild. When the courts ruled that emulation was legal, they didn't qualify it in any temporal way. They didn't rule that emulation was legal only after a system was off shelves.
It's the most popular game machine in the world.
Or that emulating a specific game was only legal after a set number of days.
Crash Bandicoot. This is the #1 Sony PlayStation title shipping today.
They ruled that emulation was legal. Period. Nintendo tries to insinuate that the devs used leaked copies in development because Xenoblade was shown running a day early, but the devs had a practice of using regional accounts to legally access games hours before the US launch. They're stretching here. It was a shame to see Ryujinx bullied out of making their usual progress reports, as if those accomplishments weren't rightfully theirs to share. But it was more of a shame seeing how quickly the bullying was accepted and legitimized. So many people have taken Nintendo's arguments at face value and blamed developers for doing things that they were within their rights to do.
They flew too close to the sun.
They shouldn't have had a Patreon
That's
page.
what you get for emulating current-gen games.
Fuck around and find out.
Consider the period when Nintendo blatantly disregarded fair use and indiscriminately copyright-claimed videos on YouTube, just because they knew no creator would stand up to them in court. You wouldn't say a channel was flying too close to the sun for reviewing a goddamn video game. You would say Nintendo is an asshole. Most of these arguments have been absolutely steamrolled by legal precedent, and I have to imagine they would have fallen flat in court. So why didn't the Yuzu developers fight back? At the time of writing, it's still not known what exactly happened with Ryujinx. A former developer has claimed that the project lead was approached at his own home and given some kind of ultimatum to stop development, presumably under the threat of getting sued into dust. One obvious reason both projects folded is that lawsuits are expensive, regardless of whether you're in the right. A multinational corporation can sink tens of millions of dollars into these battles without flinching, knowing that small developers can't keep up. Sony litigated against Bleem on multiple fronts, and the company collapsed under the financial burden of defending itself. Sony was also able to purchase the Virtual Game Station outright and discontinue it themselves. They couldn't win in court, but they still buried the emulators with a pile of money. If that's what happened to for-profit companies, the toll on a bunch of volunteer hobbyists would have been brutal. Much ado has been made about the Patreon support Yuzu was able to draw, with many singling that out as the reason for their downfall. But again, if a commercial emulator for a current-gen system was deemed legal to sell, the argument that a volunteer project receiving crowdfunding was a bridge too far is bullshit. Even with their high level of support, it's not a given that Yuzu would have been able to mount an extended legal battle against Nintendo, a company that has to mount legal battles in order to come, that has to issue injunctions to feel something. At the time of its closure, Ryujinx was barely making more on Patreon than I do, and I don't make shit. Thank you to my supporters, I appreciate it. So part of this seems like a return to their old bullying out of business strategy. Maybe Nintendo has realized that companies like Connectix and Bleem were outliers, and that most dev teams today can't or won't fight back. They don't need precedent on their side if the case will never even get to court. But there is one huge factor in Nintendo's favor. Modern games are encrypted. When the courts rendered their judgments against Sony, computers were reading the games directly from a CD drive. There were simple security measures back then. PlayStation discs had a special wobble that had to be detected before they would boot, which the first VGS build could apparently circumvent to no real consequence in its case. But the cryptographic protections on modern systems have greater legal recognition. The DMCA explicitly forbids circumventing them, albeit with exceptions. Courts frequently show flexibility in cases where defeating security is necessary for a product to continue functioning, like bypassing checks to abandoned servers or in right-to-repair scenarios. With the Wii U, maybe you could mount an argument that emulation is necessary to continue enjoying your purchases beyond the hardware life, but the Switch isn't one of those cases. It's still fully supported and playable. The DMCA rules against circumventing protections apply most strongly to cases where the primary goal is the circumvention itself. Something like a mod chip that's explicitly meant to bypass security and run pirated games. Nintendo's argument would have been that circumvention is also the sole purpose of emulation, which I and most of the community would consider an unfair distortion. However, Switch encryption seems to have been so thoroughly integrated into the games that emulation requires continuous circumvention to run them. It's a much larger part of the process than on previous systems. I have no idea how this would have been answered in a courtroom. Lawyers who actually do know what they're talking about aren't even certain.
Nintendo has a logical point, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily a winning point. We don't know what a court would do with that argument, and that means that Yuzu's looking at legal fees either way, which probably leads to a settlement.
Delroth, a major Dolphin dev, has made interesting points about the gray areas around encryption and keys. Cryptographic information isn't really copyrightable material. A string of random numbers isn't a creative work. Apple tried to get around that by decrypting with haikus, and it still didn't work. Many emulators include decryption keys as part of their software without requiring you to dump them at all. This was Nintendo's basis for blocking Dolphin on Steam, as it included the Wii's common key. The developers sought legal counsel on the matter and concluded that Nintendo was full of shit. The same DMCA section cited by Nintendo includes exemptions for interoperability of computer software, and allows the distribution of information gained through reverse engineering, like that Wii common key, when necessary for that interoperability. Dolphin has so many applications apart from just bypassing encryption, like running homebrew games and mods, and so little of its code is devoted to the circumvention that the developers seem confident they could prevail in court if it came to that. Likewise, there are many applications for Yuzu outside of piracy, like running legally owned games above 20 FPS. That's a serious argument. Transformation was a major consideration in the Connectix case, and it would be hard to argue that running Switch games at 4K 120 FPS isn't a transformative experience. So even when it comes to the prod keys, the supposed smoking gun that damned Yuzu, there was a chance of Nintendo failing in court just as Sony had done before. But it was a chance and far from a certainty. Again, a lot of this is gray area until a court decides which parts of which sections of which precedents of which factors do or don't apply. Had Nintendo won, it could have put every post-GameCube emulator on the chopping block. This is another commonly speculated reason for why Tropic Haze settled, taking Citra down with them as collateral damage. My concern afterwards was whether Nintendo was satisfied or if they would only be emboldened by the first successful emulator shutdowns in decades. The answer was unfortunately the latter. Now that it's worked twice, the question is whether this was just about the Switch, or if this is the start of an all-out strike on emulators for every previous system. Nintendo has blessed us with a long history to judge them by, and it suggests that if there is a thing, they will sue it. If you have a dream about Mario, they will C&D your subconscious. They abused Content ID on YouTube for years, to the point that some creators avoided covering them altogether. They have suspected hackers and modders stalked and surveyed. After Gary Bowser was dragged out of bed at gunpoint, they ensured his financial and social ruin to make an example out of him. It would probably be best not to get complacent about their legal team. The community could help by behaving itself better. This doesn't mean caving to the bullying and hiding all development in the shadows. It means not mass pirating games weeks before launch. Don't entangle emulators in infringement events that are visible from space. And maybe the community should start discussing what to do in the event of another lawsuit. I'm not suggesting anything specific, but now would be a good time to ponder whether you'd be willing to crowdfund a future legal defense. Because if just one more domino falls, it means all of emulation is endangered. As a reminder of what's at stake, the Video Game History Foundation found that just 13% of gaming history was available to play in some form. Nintendo can frame this as being exclusively about piracy all they want, and their most loyal defenders can sneer that preservation is always a cover for theft. Maybe the Switch doesn't need any help with game access at the moment, but in a short matter of years it will end up in the 87% pile, just like every other system has, regardless of how pervasive they were in their prime. This is why unofficial emulators exist. They make the inaccessible accessible and do the work the industry has failed to do, because its financial incentives always lead it to choose failure.
But how hyped are you for the Nintendo Switch Super 2 system? Revisit your favorite games in enhanced fidelity mode with higher frame rates, turbo resolutions, and affordable fees. Insert just $1 for 30 seconds of supercharged gameplay. Don't run out or the game will delete from your fucking account.
They spent all our money.
When full, take the Nintendo Switch Super 2 system to an authorized collection center for disbursement and thorough anti-modding policy compliance inspection. And while you're there, buy a pass for the Switch Online Expansion Pack Super Platinum tier game, a new luxury service giving access to over 40 remixed versions of Eliminator Boat Duel.
Eliminator Boat Duel.
The Nintendo Switch Super 2 system. Now you're playing with shit.